the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers and all you dirty commies out there. It's I, Douglas Lain, author of, I'm going to go with The Sea Monkey Conspiracy, a short story that was published many years ago now, too many. And I'm also the head honcho at Sublation Media. With me today is Benjamin Studebaker. Benjamin, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, the author of 2 books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about, recent news event, this ICE shooting in Minnesota that tragically took the life of Renee Good, and we're going to be talking about the political consequences of that, or how it's being understood, primarily on the left. Although we can touch upon how the right has reacted to this as well. And to start with, I want to apologize to viewers who might have been watching for a while, because some of what I'm about to say will seem familiar if you listen to my response to the pro-Palestinian movement after October 7th. This is like a microcosm of that event. And I'll try to explain what I mean briefly to you. This morning, I spent some time rereading Paul Piccone's essay on artificial negativity, and to try to understand what we're kind of stuck in, the kind of repetition that we're in. So in the thumbnail for this video, I described it as pseudo-events dominating the left, but I think that is too kind to the left to call it a pseudo-event, because it's not merely an illusory event, but rather it's a real political event that has a particular political valiance, a conservative character, which is mistaken for actual negativity in the Adornian sense, from the Marxist sense. And negativity just means critiquing what is on the basis of the potentiality of capital and bourgeois society, in order to aim to realize a different, more emancipatory future. So negativity is not simply being like pessimistic or in a demeaning way critical, but rather it is about understanding the fullness of the moment, to see what's left out.
Emphasize the sense in which something falls short of itself.
Yes, exactly. So artificial negativity would be political protest movements or critiques that fail to take up the fullness of reality, that are one-sided, but that appear to be evaluating society on the basis of its own aims, values, and purposes. So it's kind of tricky to distinguish between Marcuse's notion of one-dimensionality, where basically everything is transformed into optimization rather than transformation. So you have a social problem and you try to figure out what the technical solution might be to alter what already exists, whether those are institutions or literal technologies to correct the problem. That's a one-dimensionality approach to social problems. And then the artificially negative appears to go beyond that, appears to go beyond merely trying to optimize. Like, so in this case, the one-dimensional approach would be to say, oh, we need body cams on ICE agents, remove their masks.
To put it one way that might get it across, you can have an action that falls short of a way in which we've understood a concept or a value, but we can also have a concept which falls short of the abstraction to which the concept refers. So we might say we need to make a policy improvement to align our activity with the way in which we already understand what we're supposed to be doing.
Mhm.
But we might more fundamentally say that the way that we understand what we're supposed to be doing falls short of the potential of how we might understand what we're supposed to be doing, that our abstractions give rise to or generate.
Right. And that second approach would be what Adorno would describe as negative, right? Um, the but that's sort of misleading to people, I think. But that's true negativity, what you're pointing to. So
the negative, coming back to this idea of emphasizing what's insufficient about something, the sense in which it's not what it purports to be. It's not the abstraction in its fullness. It's just some limited iteration that falls short.
Mm-hmm. Right. So in the context of, say, an emancipated bourgeois society of equals who democratically participate in self-governance and self-governance, a critique of the excesses of the police would fall short of the kind of negative critique that might aim at removing the necessity of having a full-time police force run.
Right. If you say that the police is just not behaving the way that the police ought to behave, that doesn't ask the further question of why is it such that we have this idea that the police ought to behave in this way? And is there something else beyond that that could replace that whole mode of thinking, such that we wouldn't need a police, or if we did have a police, it would be completely reconceived, such that it would look very different from anything familiar to us?
Right. And so this is a great example because it's already historically we've seen how the artificially negative has emerged and around the murder of George Floyd. After the murder of George Floyd, there were many who would say we need to get rid of the police, and that was articulated in a couple of different ways. One was abolish the police, which was what the far left would be communists, usually young college students, would talk about. And then the other version of it was defund the police, which was a way to implement the demand or to meet the demand of abolishing, right? It's like you defund them, you replace them, you set up other apparatuses to do the job that the police are being called upon to do erroneously.
Yeah. And in both cases, what makes it artificial is that it's cut off from the more fundamental social and political question. So abolishing the police becomes something you do within the framework of liberal democratic capitalism, as opposed to something which helps you to see how you would change that framework such that it's no longer necessary to have police.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So it's worth noting that today the contingent of people that might have called for abolishing the police, which therefore might have been open to thinking more deeply and critically about what would be necessary to accomplish in order for that aim to actually be fully realized, they've as far as I can tell, largely disappeared. That what is now the most radical slogan is in this moment is, abolish ICE or defund ICE, which are synonymous. And the question of what ICE's authority is and what it ought to be is what's being argued about by the more intelligent political people.
Because ICE is a contingent form of policing, right? The ICE budget was only just recently tripled. So there seems to be a very straightforward sense in which liberal democratic capitalism is compatible with, at the very least, a much smaller ICE.
Right. And if you're my age, you remember when ICE was brought into existence after 9/11 as some sort of emergency power that was required because of the war on terrorism. So for ICE to take on the roles that it's taking now definitely is a case of mission creep. And that doesn't mean that we can simply return to the pre-war on terror regime, nor that the way to properly understand the role of ICE is through the framework of the propaganda that justified its original existence. I mean, ICE from the beginning, and as Homeland Security as well, was about disciplining American society. It was not primarily about providing security, from my perspective at the time. And you could see that in the ways in which the surveillance state was increased and the new police forces that would be on the street, or if you were protesting, what you would have to face in terms of punishment from the cops or the kind of judicial processes that you might be put in, or the rights that were limited. All of that came up immediately and was a continuity from the Clinton administration, who'd done something similar about them in reaction to domestic terrorism in the 90s.
Yeah, there was a kind of post 9/11 moment in which you could imagine that you were participating in an active, ongoing discussion about what to do in response to 9/11. And in that moment, it seemed possible to say that the post 9/11 policies were not necessary for liberal democratic capitalism. But as time passes, you get out of this moment, and it comes to be harder and harder to argue against those things in a way which seems still to be meaningfully in touch with real life, because these things become part of what's normal and how people conceptualize what it means to live in a safe society or in a society that's well ordered. It seems to be harder and harder to challenge post 9/11 security measures without also seeming to challenge these concepts, our concept of what it means to have security, our concept of what it means to have order. Right. So this window of time in which you can challenge the appendaging of the action to the concept is quite limited. But yet some people will continue to try to fight that long after that window has shut. And that
you're looking at me, aren't you?
Quixotic character.
Yeah. Just to reiterate and see if I'm hearing you correctly, the possibility of critiquing the state on the basis of the kinds of institutions that were created in the wake of 9/11 has passed. Those have been incorporated into the routine functioning of our society. And if you are going to displace them, you can't do that simply by attempting to return to the 20th century.
Yeah, because now if you were to try to challenge those policies, particularly if you talk to young people who just grew up with them and swam in them, those young people would feel that you were undermining the concept of security itself or the concept of order itself, their sense that they live in a secure and orderly society. For us, at the time, it was clear to us that in the 90s, we had been able to have security and order without the post 9/11 policies. So there was a gap between our concepts and those actions. The actions were taken in the name of those concepts. So a story was told which invoked those concepts. And that story was initially one that could be disbelieved or challenged on the basis that it doesn't seem to align with our concepts. But that story was successful politically in the sense that it came to be the case that large parts of our society now do understand those concepts in relation to those acts.
Right. And here's an example from the chat. ICE is now acting like Trump's personal militia with full immunity. So that comment does a couple of things I think that are worth noting. One is that it reifies ICE as an institution and retroactively justifying it. And maybe perhaps precisely for the reason that you just mentioned, which is that it is a political fact now that ICE has been incorporated into the normal everyday functioning of society. And as has Homeland Security. So now ICE is an institution rather than that is already corrupt based on our concept of society, is no longer thought of that way, but rather has been corrupted by Trump. Now, to give some substance to this, there has been some debate and some changes in the realm of presidential authority since Trump was elected in 2016 and then ran for for president again in 2024. And it is worth asking the question, just as a point of fact, as to whether or not the presidential immunity has been extended to ICE in a way that is different than the kind of immunity that the National Guard might face or might enjoy, or the U.S. military broadly might enjoy. Obviously, federal powers are going to be protected in a different way than local police. But what is the substance here behind this comment, Benjamin?
Well, I think that there's an impression, because Donald Trump is the one who is associated with calling for and getting past the tripling of the budget, that ICE belongs to him in some sense. Because he's the one that is the executive who's proximate to the act. But of course, the ICE budget tripling went through that big omnibus bill, passed through both houses of Congress. So it's something that doesn't simply involve the president, but also involves the legislature. Now, I do think that we're in a window of time where people could decide, in a way that would be consistent with liberal democratic capitalism, that it was a mistake to expand the ICE budget and reverse that expansion. And there's some unit of time, some fuzzy unit of time, in which that's a live question. I don't know how big that window of time is. At a certain point, if the ICE budget were regularly this year after year after year, it would cease to be a live political question and would just become baked into how we understand what our normal order is.
You know, it seems to me that if you're looking to deport millions of people, or give the impression, even rather, that you're going to crack down on illegal immigration in a way that can be shown and have political persuasiveness to your base, that you don't actually need ICE to act out these policies. That in the Reagan era, border security, and what's the institution? It's suddenly slipping my mind. What the alternative institution would be for border security and dealing with immigration? It still exists. It's still operative along the borders. What's the organization within the government?
Within the government that used to do border
It
security
still does.
prior to ICE?
Yeah.
It still exists?
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
Yeah. But anyway, the old border security, border patrol, the cops that were already doing the job, that I supplemented.
You can have somebody at the border who watches the border.
Yeah, but
the thing that they're trying to do is to remove deep inside the country large numbers of people who have lived in the country for a very long period of time, and not acting on the basis necessarily of their having a criminal record, but simply on the basis that they're in the country illegally. So they've developed a particular instrument with which to do that.
Yeah, Customs and Border Patrol is who it would be, right? And the thing is, my understanding is that there have been, even with Customs and Border Patrol, there are, rules and regulations that allow for Customs to pursue people outside of a certain range. And if you wanted to do these deportations, you could simply pass legislation to allow Customs and Border Patrol to do those kinds of actions, triple their budget. It doesn't have to be from ICE in particular. There are ways to deport people.
Yeah, the difference is that Customs and Border Patrol is really about patrolling the border. It's about keeping an eye on the point of entry, whereas ICE is meant to go deep into the territory of the country and find people, deep inside, internal. That's why a different instrument was created, to do those additional things. And then ICE agents also are fast-tracked in terms of their training. Their training is very limited and very quick for the purposes of getting very large numbers of ICE agents out into the field in a very short unit of time, so that the administration can seem to be doing this stuff in a very small unit of time. Because of the political time sensitivity of the program.
I Googled up it was the INS before ICE, the Immigration and Naturalization Service.
Yeah.
And they were responsible for removals and border enforcement and investigations into immigration and immigrants. And if that kind of organization or agency could do the same thing.
They could have expanded it. They could have done it that way, but they wanted to emphasize a discontinuity. If you just expand existing agencies, you don't send the same message of there's something new and distinctive and different that we're doing now, that we're incorporating into our understanding of what the state is. The creation of a new entity communicates that you have appendaged a new objective.
Right. And that's why ICE was created in response to 9/11, is to emphasize the discontinuity and the new threat to the homeland. That that was the political purpose of the creation.
And that was also done with a number of other agencies and services, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the reorganization of the intelligence services.
Right. So now Trump is attempting to kind of use the same logic to justify the expansion of ICE and the stripping away of certain norms and rights that have normally applied to immigrants, by emphasizing the supposed extreme threat that the immigrants pose to American.
Yeah, mix of economic arguments and law and order arguments.
Right. And so I think most people on the left would agree with just about everything we've been saying so far. The difficulty is that the kinds of political projects that are emerging from that kind of analysis just utterly fail to have to gain political traction in any direction other than the further extension of the powers of the state. They're not even really reformist to the degree that they, like defunding ICE. That's obviously a non-starter, right away. That's not going to lead anywhere except to because we saw it with George Floyd. All that did was allow for some municipal governments and state governments to pass temporary and rather toothless legislation to that only in the end ended up expanding the power of the police and their budgets, both.
Because the left doesn't have some alternative set of conceptual commitments. The Trump administration is doing what it's doing on the basis of its image of what it means to have a prosperous society and what it means to have an orderly society.
Right.
The left doesn't have an alternative vision of prosperity or order, nor does it have some alternative abstraction or concept it can appeal to, which has competitive or superior appeal. So the left is left to say, no, not this, but not in the name of anything further than what we have. And this puts the left in an objectively conservative position since it's resisting changes which others are attempting to bring about.
Okay. Now, in Marxist talk, what you're raising is a need for the negation of the negation, or for the way in which the negative, in an Adornian sense, should turn into its opposite, an alternative conception of the good, right? And I know that people who are committed to Adorno are relatively resistant to, prematurely anyway, conceptualize the negation of the negation to make that
certainly
move.
Can't be treated as a transcendent ideal, or as something which, if you were to realize it, would end contradiction or end the need for continued examination of concepts. It's not something which can produce any kind of final end or final rightness. It can't leave you having completed the system of German idealism. If you posit it in anything like those
I
terms,
so want to do that, though. I would so love to complete the system of German idealism, just to get Kantbot to come on the podcast and kneel down before me.
But that would be
anyway,
the substance of Adorno's critique of Hegel, that Hegel wants to say that it ends in a final rightness, and Adorno wants to resist that. But then people take the fact that Adorno says there can't be a final rightness to mean that you can't posit things. You can posit things, you just have to always be aware that every attempt you make is a limited attempt, even if it exceeds or goes beyond or advances in some way past a previous attempt. It will still be a limited attempt, and those who live in the attempt that you make subsequently will find things that are wrong with it. They will not regard what you make as a final rightness.
Yeah, my intuition here is that this desire to posit, and certainly in the wake of the murder or the killing in Minnesota of Renee Good, it will quickly and easily be taken up by politics as it is to suggest things like defunding the police or and creating alternative institutions within the domain of the therapeutic state, for instance.
Because it tends to be kept at that public policy level. It never gets to the stage of critiquing the concepts.
Right.
It stays at the level of the policy. So the vision, the liberal democratic vision of what does prosperity mean and what does security mean, these will be left in place. All the left will do is argue that you don't need ICE to accomplish that. All the left will do is argue that you don't need a militarized police force to accomplish that. But the concepts themselves, the framework in which we decide what's worth doing, that will not be fundamentally touched.
Right. Okay. So I think it's worth pausing here and discussing why the police, the federal police, the FBI, the CIA, ICE, why these institutions are necessary under this concept of liberty and prosperity and order. What is it do you think that necessitates this level of militarization, surveillance, and control?
Well, I think what ultimately drives it is the fact that many, many people are going to be in situations of substantial economic precarity as a consequence of capitalism. Capitalism will not make it so that you are guaranteed various kinds of things that you think that you need. And we can make a distinction between needs that seem to us to have some sort of more fundamental reality to them and needs which seem to be completely a result of the social system that we're in. We could talk about necessary and unnecessary desires, but even that distinction itself would be socially conditioned and would be something that would change over time. But what capitalism does is it creates needs that it doesn't satisfy, and then people attempt to satisfy those needs in ways which violate the rules. And so since people attempt to satisfy their needs in ways that violate the rules, there's an attempt to keep this to a minimum so that it doesn't cause the system itself to disintegrate and break down.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that evaluation. All I would add is that you can, in the period of the New Left, in terms of just material prosperity or security, most Americans, by today's standards, had more assurances, more guarantees than we have now, or have had over the last 20 years since, say, the .com bubble bursting, to put it, there. But it's worth noting that in that period of prosperity, there were values and needs the capital had created that couldn't be met. And that
even in the 50s, there were new needs that were arising that pointed beyond what capitalism could provide for. Even just simply, if you think that you need to be having a lot of fun and having exciting new experiences, if you have a 9-to-5 schedule, this conflicts with that. So any
Right.
kind of employer-employee relation will conflict with various kinds of things that people will want to do or will construe as needing to do. And therefore, any kind of employer-employee relation, if it's the foundation of society, will produce all sorts of feelings of alienation, feelings of I'm not really able to do what's meaningful activity to me because I'm constrained by what I can get paid to do.
Mm-hmm.
And as a consequence of that, people will look for various ways to act in a way that seems to them to fit with their needs better than the activity that's prescribed to them by the employer-employee relation.
Right. And you can see that also in you can see how the failure of those needs to be realized have only uh, created changes within our concepts and our institutions, which push the original needs out of view and have
if you give people money
debased
so
those
that they
needs.
can buy all their basic needs, then they're going to want the time to spend the money on things that previously would have been regarded as grandiose luxuries.
Right. But to put it in a different domain, which I've been thinking about recently, I had a conversation over the weekend with a therapist and clinician. And, the original aim of, say, psychoanalysis was to emancipate people from their own unconscious repressed impulses to give them the ability to have more self-mastery. But that has been and so you might find people in the 50s in particular who felt constrained by their family relations, their community
This is
relations.
Marcuse focused very heavily on this kind of stuff in Eros and Civilization. Civilization is constraining the erotic. Through civilization, new forms of luxurious erotic behavior had become possible, and yet civilization represses the desire of people to act on all of those impulses. So the question was, could the erotic cause people to become dissatisfied with capitalism and enact a revolution? But instead, something else happened, which is that work and play became enmeshed in the work-life balance and became mutually reinforcing.
And it's worth noting that the erotic is not merely or only like the literally sexual, but it's also a matter of the realization of the life force, or the full and expansive acting through and development of your life.
Yeah, eating, drinking, all kinds of interfacing, listening to music, looking at stuff,
making
friends,
finding friends, forming alliances, creative projects. All of these are of the erotic.
Though there's a question, I think, about the degree to which the erotic can be said to include cognition.
Yeah. Okay. I will not disagree with you there. Sometimes the brain shuts off, but let's not be too literal. But the point here is that we've seen these attempts to develop approaches of self-understanding and institutions to facilitate that, how they've been transformed into mechanisms of control, very obviously in terms of the therapeutic realm and the development of the therapeutic state and so forth. So what I'm asking people to recognize is that their dissent, the way in which they're being organized supposedly politically to act, to change and transform society towards the good, towards freedom, has also been taken up, and these institutions have been formed that will only reproduce the problem and put you at a distance from an understanding of the original idea, the original desire, the original dissatisfaction. So when we ask, was the police officer who shot Renee Good acting in self-defense? We are accepting so much of the total background conditions that the politics that emerge from that can't help but be, at the very best, conservative. It's just a wrong question. to ask in that moment. It's wrong to assume that he wasn't, just or that he was. Like it's really the wrong. It's really the wrong question. The real question is, what set up that moment on both sides, and how can we transform society so those moments aren't reproduced?
What about our world would have to change so that something like that doesn't happen?
Now I want to.
And how many layers deep do we go in answering that question? Do we just say, well, the ICE agents should have been trained more? Or do we just say that people who protest should always, obey the cops and get out of the car? How many layers deep do we go with
well,
that?
I think it's
because
good
there's
advice.
The question of why ICE exists. There's the question of why these protest groups exist. And you can go and go and go many, many layers deep into it. And that's not going to happen. People are going to see the footage and get upset about it in one direction or the other. You're going to have an acrimonious conversation, and it's not going to lead anywhere. Just like all the previous shootings that people have obsessed over, which after a couple of weeks or a couple of months fade from political consciousness and have no visible impact on things like the Donald Trump approval rating.
I want to point out what I think of as a particularly uncharitable interpretation of what I've been saying. Someone says, at least this is motivating the left. Douglas at this point is just blue MAGA. So I'm going to respond. I'd love it if you would respond to that comment as well. But my response would be, if you are motivating the left to cut itself or to castrate itself, to self-lobotomize, then it is better not to motivate the left. And this idea that I'm blue MAGA, like what does that mean? A Democrat who's MAGA, is that's just a way to not listen to what I'm actually saying. So that's my response. What do you think of that comment, Ben? I obviously got under my skin, and it was just such an obvious one. I don't know why, but anyway.
Well, resistance can't be leftism insofar as leftism is supposed to posit some alternative. And at this point, there is no alternative that's being posited. There's no other way of living or other kind of society that's being posited. It's anti-Trump resistance. Anti-stuff, anti-this, anti-that can't be leftism insofar as leftism it has a actual positive project. And the question is, what's the positive project? And if the project is just cause Donald Trump to lose the next election and get Democrats into office, then it's the project of the Democrats. It's not a project which points beyond that or extends beyond that in any way. It might be that all people are looking to do is that, and that's their horizon. But I think people ought to bear in mind that when they achieved that previously, and Joe Biden was elected, a very large number of the things that Donald Trump did were retained by the state, often to the surprise of a lot of people. Like Joe Biden did not bring the World Trade Organization appellate body back into operation. He kept it dysfunctional. Lots of things that Donald Trump did were kept in place. But of course, what happens there every time there's a new president is a bunch of executive orders which repeal the previous set of executive orders. And this creates a sense in people that something is being achieved. But most of the important things are not done by executive order anyway.
Mm-hmm. So someone else comes along and says, no, oppose Trump, which is what matters right now. To anti-Trump resistance, that's what we need right now. They don't address what you're saying, of course. But
well, there's a disagreement. They have a different set of fundamental goals.
Right. But I just wonder what they're doing, listening to or participating in any kind of socialist or Marxist project. I mean, it doesn't, if what you want is the other version, the other party that runs the capitalist state to be in power, regardless of what the actual consequences of that might be, but simply out of some sort of deeply felt partisanship. Why would you even dabble with Marxism or socialism or the idea of an independent politics based on the working class or civil society that could overcome these contradictions more fully? Why would that even be of interest to you? I don't understand. I mean, I do understand historically. I understand how we ended up here, but it's very. I just ask you to just stop being a socialist. Anyway, I'm just reacting. Obviously,
with
somehow
or
this
without
bothers me.
anti-Trump resistance, Trump is going to be gone within
Yeah.
a few years' time.
Yeah.
With or without.
Right, and there will either be a Republican who's elected after, maybe a one-termer, or a Democrat. And if it's a Democrat, then it's very likely that we will see the large portions of the Trump agenda being taken up by the Democrats and refined and professionalized and implemented as something
and not just that, but that the Democrats will often do things which, if Donald Trump were doing them, people would object to. But they won't object to those things when they're done by Democrats. If Donald Trump were in office when Russia invaded Ukraine and we got into a major conflict with Russia over Ukraine, people would have very different attitudes to that.
Yeah, the example that comes to mind for me is Clinton and welfare reform. That was on the agenda of Ronald Reagan and Bush for about a decade, and they could not get the political will, couldn't get the votes to put that through, but Clinton could. And so I would expect something similar. The way that people assume Trump has no political ideology, but is simply kind of villainous, does a great service for Democrats who want to come along and take up that actual agenda later, because they won't recognize what it is, because they haven't paid any attention to what he's actually doing, but just thought of him as, I don't know, a movie monster or something like that. So
what is actually going on in the world? Why are people doing the things that they're doing?
Mm-hmm.
If you focus on not liking somebody in particular and trying to get rid of a particular person, you concretize all of the problems in a particular person
mm-hmm.
and make it concrete, make it somebody or some group of people that you can despise, then an understanding of the actual abstract operation of the system becomes impossible.
And all along, by the way,
classic defense of capitalism is to get people to concretize it in relation to particular people or to particular groups.
Mm-hmm. And this approach has done nothing but elevate Trump. The anti-Trump resistance is half the time campaigning for Trump.
Well, by making him seem to be not normal, irregular, mm-hmm. he seems to be a change agent for people who want things to be different. So the more you emphasize his abnormality, the easier it is for him to frame himself as an anti-establishment person who is an underdog, who is going up against an entrenched elite or an entrenched deep state bureaucracy or what have you. The way to defeat Trump, and I've said this for years and years and years, going all the way back into the 10s, is to treat him as a normal politician.
Yeah.
And to emphasize the sense in which the things he's doing are normal. They are normal things that American presidents do. He is not managing to fundamentally transform the character of the thing. He is an expression of the badness of the thing. He has not corrupted or tainted or ruined it. He is an expression of the badness of it. That's the way to deal with him. But this is not something that people have been able to sustain for any great length of time.
Right. And I think largely because there's no motivation to, ultimately, because there's no alternative concept.
Right. There's nothing to discipline people. There's no vision of what it is that anybody's supposed to be doing. And so in that sense, there is no leftism which would be committed to anything beyond the present situation. There's just various forms of reactionary resistance.
Right. Yeah. And what's so disappointing or depressing to me about these moments is how people who are old enough to remember the last iteration and who claim to have the values of Marxism or socialism, or claim to want more substantive transformation in society will not just get swept up and nod along, but cheerlead and develop the repetition. And along the way, it actually gets worse. Like after George Floyd, there was at least a small contingent of people who were talking about abolishing the cops and attempting to have reading groups and things like that to think through what would be necessary for that. Of course, they were swept along behind the Democratic Party's electoral campaigns and, were quickly marginalized, and their slogans turned to policy proposals and things like that. But nonetheless, they existed. I'm not even seeing that this time around. It seems like a lot of people are saying, oh no, all of those kinds of questions, what would be necessary to abolish ICE and not to have the need for such a security apparatus, those are distractions from the immediate goal of opposing Hitler, I guess, still, so. Yeah, and I feel also I'm being swept along into a repetition because this is something I would have said 5 years ago. This is
well, it becomes very difficult if you're in a dialogue where the other participants in the dialogue are operating at that particular level to do anything which would constitute an advance, because you are continuously being dragged into, but what about the orange man? What about the orange man? The orange man is bad. What are we going to do about bad orange man? Mm-hmm. That has become an intellectually incredibly stultifying thing that has been afflicting us continuously for the last decade and making everybody stupider all the time.
Right. And I truly want to stop being caught in that dynamic. And this stream was all about breaking free from that dynamic. That was the point of it. So I'm going to ignore the comments and let's push on here a little bit. So let me ask you this. When you think about Piccone, as I've described it, and maybe I should describe it again, the concept of artificial negativity, which is not merely a concept, but which has also been institutionalized. In other words, the various NGOs and nonprofit groups that organize political dissent into protest in reaction to whatever geopolitical or local, national event dominates the headlines. All of these can be thought of as the institutions of artificial negativity. What I wanted to ask you is, do you think recognizing that fact, being able to say, okay, when I want to get involved politically on the left, I should first test out the degree to which these projects and these protest movements are starting out within a pre-existing network of power that's coming from the state? Is that useful? And also, would it be useful to kind of test out the limits of the concepts that are informing the slogans and projects that
emerge? I think a person has to ask themselves what it is that they actually believe in at this particular time. And of course, what you believe in is going to change. You'll continuously find your images of what would be a better way for us to live fall short. You'll continuously update and revise them. But we have to start with what we positively are trying to do. If we don't have a positive project of some kind, then we're not offering an alternative to anybody. And if we're not offering an alternative to anybody, then all we can do is rain on the parade of people politically, which is why, insofar as I don't see something to do, I just don't do politics. If I don't see something to do, then we're not in a political situation where there's something to advocate for. And this is the trouble. We're really not in a political situation where there's something to advocate for. So we are condemned to watch the Democrats and the Republicans fight over who's going to be president in 2028.
Yeah, I mean, there are, I'm going to bring up the Campaign for a Socialist Party, right? And their work with immigrants. And my understanding is that rather than creating protests or aiming at confronting ICE agents, the campaign has recognized the limits of its power and the skills and abilities that they actually do have on offer to help people who are facing deportation or oppression, and are instead helping people get counsel or just everyday, uh, means of sustenance, or helping them hook up with jobs and things like, to basically avoid deportation within society as it is, without turning that into a political protest or trying to gather a constituency around their efforts immediately, or in even the midterm, not meaning midterm elections, but just in the middle ground.
Charitable work.
Yeah, activist work, not charitable exactly, but but yeah, because it has an aim politically down the road, but it's immediately just solidarity and mutual aid, basically.
Well, we don't know if it's going to have that political implication. We do
Right.
know that in the day-to-day operation, it's charitable work, in the
Okay,
sense
so
that there are particular people in need that are being helped.
So 20 Faces 6915 says mass confronting ICE helps change mass opinion and influences politics. No, it does not. It may influence politics, and it may even change mass opinion, but it doesn't have any possibility of changing politics. What you can do is you might be able to change mass opinion to the extent that the Republican voting base is demoralized, doesn't get out to vote, and a certain portion of the voting base for the Democrats are excited and activated and do get out and vote, and then that
I
will
don't
mean
even think it does that, to be clear.
it could. It has. I mean, I think.
The history of this kind of stuff is that if you make some kind of mess, if you create an appearance of disorder by protesting and getting into clashes with the police, this doesn't generally help those who are looking to resist what the state is doing.
No, and look,
unless you have broad sympathy from the public in doing that. And so there has been a quest to get that kind of broad sympathy, but that hasn't really materialized. What typically happens is it polarizes on the basis of pre-existing culture war positions. So people's interpretation of this event is entirely a consequence of where they sit in a permanent culture war, which exists with or without this issue, and which gives people ready-made views, ready-made takes about almost anything that happens.
Right. There are moments, though, within living memory where a confrontation with police has actually led to mass sympathy. Or at least that was the story the left told itself. After Occupy Wall Street began, there was a confrontation with police, which seemed to create, conditions where recruitment and mass participation were more possible.
But who benefited electorally at that time? If you're thinking about it in the way they're thinking about it, in terms of trying to damage the president, who benefited electorally? The Tea Party benefited electorally. And who benefited in the 60s from the protests and the confrontations with the police? Richard Nixon benefited electorally. If we're talking about
around
just that.
2011, the Tea Party benefited, I guess. I thought Obama got reelected, and that was
the 2010 midterm elections. The Tea Party gained an enormous number of seats in the 2010 midterms. And then Obama was narrowly was reelected with a larger margin than some conservatives were expecting, but with a reduced margin relative to his first outing. And so going into the second term, he had relatively little room to maneuver in Congress and didn't get very much done.
That's true. But 2010 was before Occupy. So Occupy didn't create the conditions to help the Tea Party. But rather,
the Occupy in 2011 was in large part frustration with the fact that the Tea Party had been successful in 2010 and that there was no directionality. And then there was a search for directionality, which reached its zenith with Bernie Sanders in 2016, but it never ultimately found directionality. There has not been, and now people will frame Mamdani as if he's an instance of having found directionality. But I don't think anybody ever did find directionality. I don't think Occupy led to something concrete that we can point to and say, here's where things began to improve or began to get better. How can anybody say that when Donald Trump is the president again? How can anybody say that Occupy resulted in anything that they wanted to see without implicitly praising this present situation?
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right on that front. I just was saying, if you just restrict your view to a relatively small moment in time, there was a confrontation with the police that then led to, in a brief moment, on a small scale, to the rising popularity of Occupy.
The bigger the mess is, what we see historically in the United States is typically no substantial political impact, or it helps whoever is aligned with the police and the military.
Right.
The bonus army demonstrators in 32, when they got bulldozed by the tanks of the army, when they pulled people immediately afterwards, the polls indicated that people supported the army in bulldozing the tanks, bulldozing the camp. Even in a case where you're talking about World War I veterans who are protesting on the basis that they've been reduced to poverty, confrontations with the army and the police in the United States do not get results for the people who are involved in those confrontations, pretty much across the board.
And if you look at international examples like the Arab Spring, what occurred through those confrontations and upheavals was in state, were military dictatorships, strengthening of the military.
In many cases, in a lot of those Arab Spring contexts, when people take to the streets, they think we're going to get rid of the dictator and we're going to have a liberal democratic state like the kind of state that exists in other parts of the world.
Right.
So when they're doing that, they have an image of what they want, a positive image that's motivating them. But when your protest is purely about saying, I don't like this, I want to resist this, I want to stop this, I hate this, no, there is nothing behind it that can actually spur people to make long continuing sacrifices on behalf of that goal at any kind of scale. And this is why then you start getting all these theories about what is the psychoanalytic mode that the Western protester is in, because it doesn't seem to be aimed at getting a result. If it were aimed at getting a result, there would be more discontent than there is about the lack of effectiveness of the protest methods. You don't have this kind of conversation when you're dealing with demonstrators in a place like Iran or in a place like Egypt, because in those contexts, there are very clear alternatives that are on the agenda that those protesters can be demanding. And if there's a question, it's a question about which one of those alternatives is the one that is actually doing the motivational work here.
Okay, so 20 Faces 6915 is repeating a talking point I want to address for whatever, I think, because I have I'm a masochist. What Benjamin is saying is very counterintuitive. It obviously demoralizes your opponents and energizes your side. Trump got elected because this is a white Christian majority nation. Well,
if that's the case, that's always the case. If demographics determine who's the president, then that should determine every election, and nobody should ever struggle to do anything. Because the demographics will determine who the president is. And that kind of argument doesn't make any sense.
It's also counterfactual. In 2024, Trump made some substantial gains with non-white voters and lost white votes. And the reason he lost in 2020 was largely due to his white elderly base turning against him. So I just think
it's fundamentally racist to claim that race explains who the president is. Because it implies that racial categories are sufficiently real that you can predict people's political behavior on the basis of skin color.
And I agree with you as a value, from the start, but also it doesn't wash empirically. It just isn't the case that people vote based on their skin color. So, maybe we might say, I think people think that white people in particular vote out of racial solidarity, but I don't think that's true either. That obviously that isn't true. So
there are some cases where people have been racialized because they've been organized on the basis of race.
Right.
But that's a contingent set of organizational questions. rather than something which can fundamentally explain. And if you're talking about white people in the United States, you're talking about people with an enormous variety of religious and political and ideological affiliations.
Right. I agree. So anyway, what I would, to return to the end, or to return to the beginning here at the end, because we're about an hour in, I should let you go. I know you have a plane to catch, which means, unfortunately, this week there will not be a Parrot Room, but I will encourage people to sign up for our Patreon, because there's a lot of things that you don't get to see on the YouTube channel that just are for patrons only, that are worthwhile, including the last Parrot Room with Chris Catrone, which you should go check out, about Pax Americana. If you are outraged by this conversation, you'll be triply outraged by that one. But I just want to say, my goal in this new year is to not repeat arguments that I've had over the last decade often. And I set out to not repeat the arguments from the last decade in this podcast. I did not meet my goal. I ended up repeating them anyway.
Maybe we need a 3 strikes rule.
So the third strike, I just have to leave. Is that
the third strike? You can never mention that thing again, ever.
Oh, so in this case, it would be, what would it be for me? Do you think that I should implement a third 3 strike rule around Trump? I can never mention Trump again after I've mentioned him 3 times.
I think you can. Trump is going to do new things. So you will have to talk about Trump, because he's going to be president. He's going to do new things. But there are certain things that have been said about Trump many times, which, how many more times do they need to be said?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the other approach that I'm hoping to take is to change up the formal structure of the content we produce, to move away from the discourse as it is set up. And so these kinds of conversations that we're having, like the one we're having right now, just structurally or formally get pushed in this direction of sound bites, responding to set.
The event itself is extremely limited in terms of what it intellectually permits or encourages. It's difficult and arduous even to try to sustain an interesting conversation in relation to shootings.
Right. And which was the whole point of this podcast. You've articulated it well here at the end. I will leave it there. Go join the Patreon. There's more to come, and thank you for watching.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.